early this morning. He'd hanged himself using his bed sheets. He wasn't on suicide watch. Harold Shipman killed more people than anyone else in British peacetime history. He was convicted of 15 murders, but those were just the tip of the iceberg. An inquiry later decided that he had definitely killed a staggering 215 victims, all of them patients he was supposed to be caring for. The real figure could have been as high as 260. Now he's taken his own life. He was found in his prison cell at 6:20 a.m. An inquiry will investigate how he was able to do it, why he wasn't being watched more closely. We'll talk to a relative of one of Shipman's victims a little later. First, here's Mark Webster with the very latest.
Death claimed a killer in the early hours of this morning. Later, a funeral van left Wakefield prison with the body of Britain's most deadly serial murderer. For the families of Harold Shipman's hundreds of victims, it will leave forever unanswered the question of why he killed on such a scale, and if he ever felt any genuine remorse for the terrible suffering he caused.
Obviously just very shocked, very angry that he's not going to pay for his crimes now, is he? But I think it's fairly typical. He's a coward.
Local people welcomed his death.
Well, I think he's done the right thing. I think we're all glad to see the back of him, don't you?
God, I'm glad. Glad that he has. Justice for the people, you know.
Could have come clean, really. You know, before this has happened again, it's stormed up again for everybody, really.
Shipman had been held here at Wakefield Prison since June last year and was not on suicide watch because a member of staff said he'd been behaving normally. Though last month he'd been stripped of his privileges for poor behaviour, his television set was removed and he had to wear prison uniform rather than casual clothes.
He was housed in a single cell on his own. He was found hanging from some ligature point behind his curtains, so he wasn't altogether visible. The staff apparently saw him there, alerted and got the door open and went in and attempted to resuscitate him, but obviously he was dead.
Hiding behind this image of the avuncular local GP, Harold Shipman was able to carry out a monstrous catalogue of crimes. Crimes against the very people who trusted him. He's put an end to whatever he was feeling. The terrible pain he caused to hundreds of others will be his only lasting epitaph. Mark Webster, ITV News.
Giovanni Di Stefano is Harold Shipman's lawyer and he joins us now. Well, Mr. Di Stefano, what do you think? What's your reaction to today's events?
Well, we were certainly astounded, to say the least, that a person who finally, in December, we'd managed to get together arguable grounds of appeal against his conviction, should suddenly take his own life within a month of that situation occurring. So this is an inquiry that really needs to be far stretched and needs to be looked into very carefully, taking into consideration.
Sorry, I was just going to ask you, when did you last speak to him and did he give you any indication that he might take his own life?
Well, the question of correspondence is privileged, but we certainly corresponded with him before Christmas. We notified him of the case in the Court of Appeal that we were awaiting to decide a judicial precedent on an arguable ground of appeal. That occurred on the 9th of December, and on the 20th of December we notified Dr. Shipman that there were finally grounds of appeal which could be argued in the Court of Appeal. So, may have been successful, may not have been successful.
So he gave you
on that date.
He gave you no clue at all as that he might do what he has done?
Well, it certainly surprised us. One does not commit suicide when finally one has a hope. Remember that Dr. Shipman has always denied committing any murder whatsoever. It's always vehemently denied that. However, for everybody, so that he dies a convicted person. But obviously we'll see what happens in due course, because there are provisions in the Criminal Appeal Act which do allow us to proceed with an appeal if the interests of justice so desire.
Well, Mr. Di Stefano, thank you very much. The sheer scale of Harold Shipman's crimes is still difficult to comprehend. The judge at his trial said he was guilty of wickedness that defies belief. He was a family doctor who, until near the end, spent 23 years taking lives instead of saving them. John Draper looks now at the life of the GP who became known as Dr. Death.
Harold Shipman was highly intelligent, but he was also arrogant with a sense of his own superiority. That came out under police interrogation.
I suggest to you that you have injected Mrs. Grundy with a fatal overdose of morphine that brought about her death.
No.
Even in a police cell protesting his innocence, he refused to talk to detectives he believed were beneath his station. But bit by bit they put together the horrifying case against him. Shipman was interviewed on ITV in 1982, appearing the caring doctor.
If you can stay in the community, receive your treatment in the community, with your family around you, your usual friends, then this all adds to the speed of recovery from the illness.
But as this interview was being conducted, he'd already begun murdering elderly patients. His last victim was Kathleen Grundy, a lively and energetic 81-year-old, but also wealthy. He killed her in June 1998 and forged her will to give himself £400,000. That greed was to be his undoing. A police investigation led initially to around 20 suspicious deaths of elderly people. The true figure is now thought to be more than 10 times that many. But not all were pensioners. Elaine Oswald was 25. She believes he tried to kill her by prescribing morphine for a stomach upset.
He gave me a prescription for some painkillers, which I wasn't even taking aspirin. You know, the pain wasn't that bad. But he told me to go and get this prescription filled, go straight home, go to bed, and he would visit me after his surgery hours. He said it would be about noon or just afterwards.
The same line he spun to so many patients. Go home and leave the front door open, I'll visit you later. But the home visits of Dr. Death were to spell misery for hundreds of innocent people and their families. Whatever the questions to be raised about his death, few will mourn his passing. John Draper, ITV News.
So how could it happen? How could Britain's worst serial killer be allowed to kill himself? It has emerged that Shipman wasn't on suicide watch despite the gravity of his crimes. And it has happened before. The serial killer Fred West also hanged himself in jail. Here's Angus Walker on the questions facing the prison service.
Life for Harold Shipman was exactly that. In prison language, he was a natural lifer with no prospect of ever being released. Yet he was subject to the normal prison regime on an open wing like this one, sharing his section of Wakefield Prison with another 27 inmates. But Shipman had been falling out with staff, arguing with officers. He'd had some privileges withdrawn, his TV had been taken away. And yet he was still subject to the normal monitoring of a Category A prisoner, checked just once an hour through the night.
Last year we had 94 suicides in prisons in England and Wales. It was the same figure the year before that. With prison numbers increasing, the prison service has an enormously difficult task.
Fred West, another high-profile serial killer, managed to commit suicide in his cell on New Year's Day 1995. The perception is that the extreme nature of their crimes would mean that they're automatically placed on 24-hour suicide watch, but that's not necessarily the case.
Shipman was never going to get out of prison. And the bottom line, I think, is if any individual inside wants to take their own life, eventually they will do it, because no one in prison service can be kept under total 24-hour surveillance.
Shipman's suicide will be investigated by the new prison's ombudsman, Stephen Shaw, who wasn't meant to take up his role until April, but the Home Office has fast-tracked his powers, conscious of Shipman's high profile and the gravity of his crimes. Angus Walker, ITV News, at Prison Service Headquarters.
More on Harold.
Hello and welcome to the BBC's News at 1 o'clock.
The serial killer Harold Shipman has been
found dead in his cell at Wakefield Prison. The former doctor was discovered by prison officers hanging strips of bed just after 6 o'clock this morning. Attempts to resuscitate him failed. Shipman was jailed for life for murdering 15 women.
Manchester. A public inquiry later decided that he killed at least 215 of his patients. The service says Shipman was not on suicide watch and an investigation has been ordered. James Westhead reports.
Just after 11 o'clock, Harold Shipman's body leaves Wakefield Prison near Leeds. It was here in the early hours of the morning that Britain's worst mass murderer apparently took his own life, hanging himself with bedsheets from the window bars of his
24-hour suicide watch, but that's not necessarily the case.
Shipman was never going to get out of prison. And the bottom line, I think, is if any individual inside wants to take their own life, eventually they will do it.
The perception
that the extreme nature of their crimes
would mean that they're automatically placed on 24-hour suicide watch, but that's not necessarily the case.
Shipman was never going to get out of prison. And the bottom line, I think, is if any individual inside wants to take their own life, eventually they will do it, because no one in prison service can be under total 24-hour surveillance.
Shipman's suicide will be investigated by the new prison's ombudsman,
sure who wasn't meant to take up
his role until April, but the Home Office has fast-tracked his powers, conscious of Shipman's high profile and the gravity of his crimes. Angus Walker, ITV News at Prison Service Headquarters.
More